The night pressed in quietly around Naomi Carter, the room's stillness far too loud. Only the ticking of the antique wall clock indicated that time was moving forward, though in her world, time had long stopped meaning anything. 2 years. It has been 2 years since she married Brandon Hayes. 2 years since she wore the silk and lace of a wedding gown, heart fluttering like a teenager's, cheeks glowing with hope, whispering silent prayers to a love she thought would bloom over time. But the bed remained untouched, and so did she. She sat at the edge of it, back straight, hands clasped in her lap like a schoolgirl trying to behave, though no one was left to impress. The room was exquisite, cream-colored walls, velvet drapes, marble floors that caught the moonlight. But Naomi felt like a ghost. Beautiful, polished, and completely invisible. Her fingers smoothed the silk hem of her nightgown, the same one she had worn on their wedding night. Not because of sentimentality, not anymore, but because it was the last thing in her closet that still reminded her she once had hope. I hope Brandon will turn to her one night and say her name like it meant something. I wish his cold eyes thaw when they look at her. Hope that the distance between them, physical, emotional, existential, might narrow even slightly. But Brandon had never reached for her. Not on that first night, not once since. She remembered the moment it started the unraveling. The second the honeymoon suite door closed behind them, Brandon loosened his tie, picked up his phone, and muttered something about needing to catch up on emails. He hadn't looked back at her once, and that had set the tone for the next 730 nights. Some nights, she tried to lie to herself. He's tired. He's stressed. Maybe he doesn't know how to express affection. But the lie had grown heavy. It clung to her like a coat soaked in rain, uncomfortable, suffocating, and impossible to remove. She leaned forward now, elbows on her knees, palms pressed to her forehead, breathing slowly, deliberately, like someone trying not to break. But inside, something had already cracked. She was 26 years old and had never been kissed like she mattered, never been touched with tenderness, never felt wanted. Her friends whispered about passion, late-night laughter, and husbands who couldn't keep their hands off them. Naomi, meanwhile, carried the shame of knowing her wedding ring was little more than a silent shackle. A soft breeze snuck through the crack of the window, brushing her bare arms like a memory that never existed. She shivered, not from cold, but from the stark realization that she had been married for 2 years and had never been loved. Not really. Not even once. She stood and crossed the room to the vanity. The mirror reflected her softly glowing skin, almond-shaped eyes full of pain, and a mouth too tired to fake another smile. She looked older than she should, not in years, but in spirit, like her soul had aged faster than her body, worn down by the weight of being overlooked. How ironic, she thought. People looked at her and saw elegance, grace, and quiet strength. But inside, she felt like a painting no one bothered to hang, framed, yet forgotten. And still, every day, she played her part, the dutiful wife, the woman who smiled at charity events, who stood beside her husband while he shook hands and offered political answers to personal questions, who returned home to a house that echoed with emptiness, a house with too many rooms and too few moments of connection. She had asked herself 1,000 times, is it me? Was she not beautiful enough, not exciting enough, not desirable? But self-blame was just another chain. And tonight, as she looked into her own eyes in the mirror, she felt something different stir, something small and quiet, but dangerous in its awakening. Resentment. Why had she allowed this? Why had she accepted a love That wasn't love at all. Her fingertips brushed the delicate chain around her neck, her mother's locket. Inside, a faded photograph of a couple who had laughed, argued, and danced in the kitchen. Real love. Messy, loud, imperfect, but real. Naomi's marriage was pristine, but it was also empty, and she was tired of pretending that was enough. The clock struck midnight, echoing like a distant gunshot. Naomi exhaled, long and slow, and for the first time in years, she didn't pray for Brandon to touch her. She prayed for courage. She didn't know yet that change was coming, but it was. It had sharp blue eyes, a voice like velvet and iron, and a name that had haunted her more than she'd ever admit, Ethan Whitmore. But that's a story for another night. If this glimpse into Naomi's quiet heartbreak resonated with you, I'd love to know what part stayed with you most. Leave me a comment. Your words keep this story alive. And if you believe love stories should be told with depth, soul, and a little fire, don't forget to like and follow. There's so much more to Naomi's journey than what meets the eye. After all, sometimes, the silence is just the beginning. The morning sun spilled through the tall windows, casting warm streaks of light across the pristine white linens of the bed Naomi never shared. It was ironic how something as cold and hollow as her marriage could look so flawless from the outside. A picture-perfect life that glistened like glass, but shattered beneath a single touch of truth. Naomi sat at the breakfast table, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea that had long since cooled. Across from her sat Brandon, dressed in tailored navy, eyes locked on his phone screen, lips pursed as he scrolled through emails with surgical precision. He hadn't looked at her once. Not that she expected him to anymore. Their mornings had become a silent routine. He read. She pretended to drink. They sat in the same room, breathing the same air, yet lived in entirely different dimensions. There was no warmth, laughter, or shared memory being made. Only two strangers playing the roles they'd been cast in. Brandon finally set his phone down, but not to speak to her. He reached for his watch instead, fastening it with a practiced wrist flick. Naomi watched him, studying every movement like a woman trying to decipher a language she had never been taught. "You'll be at the fundraiser tonight?" he asked flatly, eyes still on his Rolex. It wasn't a question. It was a requirement. "Yes," she answered softly, her voice barely disrupting the air between them. "Wear the red dress." And just like that, he stood and left. No kiss. No goodbye. Just the echo of his footsteps down the marble hallway. Naomi stared at the space he left behind, wondering if it would ache less if he were cruel. At least cruelty could be confronted. But Brandon's indifference, it was like drowning in clear water. No waves, no thrashing. Just a slow, invisible descent, until nothing remained but silence. She used to blame herself. In the early days, she'd questioned everything. Had she said something wrong? Not done enough? Been too much or not enough? She bought new lingerie. She lit candles, cooked his favorite meals, asked questions, gave him space. She tried everything, exhausting herself to mold into someone he might desire. But he never responded, not with a glance, a word, or the hunger she saw between other husbands and wives. One night, early in their first year, she had reached out in bed, fingertips brushing his shoulder beneath the sheets. A simple, silent plea for connection. He had tensed, quietly stood, murmuring about early meetings, and disappeared into his office. She never reached out again. After that moment, Naomi began to understand that what they had wasn't broken, it had never existed. She was a wife only in title, a fixture in Brandon's life, like the chandelier above their dining room table. Elegant, well-placed, admired at a distance, but never truly seen. Still, she stayed, because walking away from a life so carefully constructed felt like failure. Because she thought if she just held on a little longer, he'd meet her halfway. That real love, was something you earned if you were patient and kind. But kindness doesn't bloom where nothing is planted. And Brandon had never even tried. Their public life was a theater of perfection. They attended galas arm in arm, posed for magazines, and exchanged rehearsed smiles for the press. The city adored them, a power couple, modern royalty. But behind every photo was a woman crumbling in silence. Naomi didn't envy the women who envied her. She pitied them. Because they didn't know the truth. A palace can still feel like a prison. She glanced at the clock. Still, 2 hours before she had to meet her stylist. "The red dress," he said, as if it were a costume, as if wearing it would somehow breathe life into the illusion they lived. Rising from her chair, she wandered through the hallway with black and white photos from their wedding. She paused at one near the staircase, a candid shot of Brandon slipping a ring on her finger. Her face glowed, full of a hope that now felt foreign. Brandon looked polished, handsome, but distant. Even then, before everything truly began, he wasn't present. Naomi touched the frame, fingertips brushing the glass, as though she could reach back through time and whisper to that version of herself, "You deserve more than this." But the past was untouchable. She climbed the staircase slowly, each step a small rebellion against the weight pressing on her chest. Her heels clicked softly on the hardwood floor until she reached the bedroom door. She opened it and entered the quiet sanctuary of the space she had grown to loathe and rely on. She crossed to the mirror. For a long moment, she stared. Naomi Carter was beautiful, not just in how magazines defined beauty, but in how her presence lingered. Her skin glowed deep bronze in the morning light. Her eyes carried storms, and her full lips held stories she'd never told. She was elegance and ache wrapped in silk. But today, her reflection looked different. There was a shift, subtle, but it was there. The woman in the mirror wasn't broken. She wasn't weak. She was tired, yes, wounded. But something new simmered beneath the surface, a flicker of defiance, a whisper of awakening. She didn't know where that fire would take her, but she knew this. She would no longer beg for love where there was none. She would no longer dress up the hollowness and call it life. She had survived 2 years of being invisible. Now, she was beginning to see herself again. And soon, very soon, so would someone else. It had been exactly 731 days since Ethan Whitmore last saw her, and still, her name had never left the corner of his mind, where she'd quietly taken up residence. Not once. He remembered that night, with surgical clarity, a charity gala, hosted beneath 1,000 golden lights, the air thick with champagne and ego. Ethan had arrived late, as usual. These events bored him. Everyone shook hands with practiced ease, their words polished, their intentions shallow. He could read people too well to be charmed by any of it. But then she entered. He didn't know her name back then. All he saw was a woman in a soft ivory gown, standing slightly apart from the crowd, one hand wrapped gently around a glass of sparkling water. While others postured and performed, she stood quietly composed, as if she belonged, yet didn't care to prove it. There was something grounded in her elegance, like still water hiding deep currents. Ethan had been in the middle of a conversation with a senator when he noticed her. He stopped listening. Something about her presence demanded attention without asking for it. Her smile was reserved, but real. Her eyes held thought, not calculation. And when she laughed, low, melodic, and completely unforced, Ethan felt it like an ache under his skin. He had turned to excuse himself, prepared to introduce himself, ask her name, and hear how it sounded in her voice. But Brandon Hayes appeared beside her before he could take the first step, and she turned to him with warmth in her eyes. It hadn't made sense. Brandon Hayes, the man, was icy ambition wrapped in designer wool. Ethan respected his mind, but never his heart. Brandon shook hands like he was bored with people and smiled like it cost him something. And here was this woman, glowing with sincerity, offering her trust to a man who looked like he barely registered she existed. Ethan watched, jaw tight, as Brandon placed a casual hand at the small of her back. She didn't flinch. She leaned slightly toward him. Loyalty, affection, whatever it was real for her. That was the moment Ethan knew he'd already lost. So he walked away. He buried her in the back of his mind, under layers of work, women, negotiations, and late-night flights. But she never disappeared completely. Sometimes she returned to him, in fragments. A glimpse of a woman laughing at a sidewalk cafe, the echo of a voice in a crowd, the ghost of a perfume as he passed through a hotel lobby. He tried to convince himself she was just a passing infatuation, a face, a mood. But when he learned her name 6 months later, Naomi Carter, it stuck like a shard under his skin. He never said it aloud, never allowed it to cross his lips. But he knew it. He had watched Brandon rise over the past 2 years, as the tabloids called them, the silent power couple, as if silence were a virtue in love. Ethan had seen the photographs Naomi by Brandon's side, her posture perfect, her eyes polite, but her smile never reached her eyes, and Ethan noticed every time. Then, one morning, a single line from an internal business memo changed everything. Brandon Hayes and Naomi Carter have finalized their divorce. It was meant to be a footnote, another headline among mergers and acquisitions. But Ethan couldn't breathe for a full minute. He stood in his office, the city sprawling out beneath him, and all he could hear was her name echoing like a starting bell. She was free, and he was no longer required to stay away. He had told himself for 2 years that he respected boundaries, respected vows even when they were loveless. But now, those vows were dust, and the ache that had once been silent began to throb with violent clarity. He sat back in his chair, fingertips pressed to his temples, heart beating harder than in years. What was it about her? He had known countless women, intelligent, beautiful, accomplished. Women who flirted with elegance, who chased him with confidence. But none of them lingered in his thoughts the way Naomi did. She wasn't loud. She didn't chase. She simply existed. And that had been enough to haunt him. He opened a folder and found a private investigator's report he had never ordered, but that someone on his staff had quietly compiled, anticipating his eventual curiosity. Inside, her new address. A modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood. Recently leased. No staff, no doorkeeper, no trace of Brandon, no protection. Ethan stared at the paper, torn between impulse and logic. But his instincts had always been stronger than his self-control. He stood, shrugging on his dark wool coat, eyes sharp with something unspoken. His assistant glanced up as he moved past her. "Sir, your meeting with Beijing just got rescheduled." "Should I clear my morning?" he said, already at the elevator. "Should I reschedule the—" "No." She blinked, surprised. "Where are you going?" He didn't answer, just stepped into the elevator, the doors whispering shut behind him. The city outside was waking slowly, gray with winter light, indifferent and noisy. But Ethan barely noticed it. His world had narrowed to a single name. A woman who didn't know he'd spent 2 years trying not to want her. A woman who had given her heart to a man who didn't see her. A woman who once stood beneath chandeliers and smiled through sadness. He was going to see her, not as a billionaire, not as a rival to her ex-husband, but as the man who never forgot her. And this time, he wouldn't walk away. Naomi had always loved quiet places, not the kind of quiet that felt lonely, but the type that hummed with low conversations, the clinking of ceramic cups, and the comforting scent of roasted beans and steamed milk. This cafe, tucked into a sleepy corner of the city, had become her haven. The kind of place where no one looked twice at her, where anonymity was not just possible, but expected. She sat at her usual window seat, a small table scarred with years of coffee rings and nervous fingertip tapping. Outside, the sky was thick with the promise of rain, and her breath left faint traces on the glass as she leaned forward slightly, stirring her drink, though it no longer needed stirring. Naomi didn't come here for the coffee. She came for the stillness. She came to feel like herself again, whatever version of her remained. Her reflection in the window looked different lately. Not in the way that showed on the surface, but in the shadows beneath her eyes, the quiet defiance in her jawline. Since the divorce, her world had gotten smaller, by choice. Gone were the designer gowns, the staged photo ops, the house with too many rooms echoing with too little warmth. She had traded extravagance for authenticity, and still, the emptiness found her. Some nights, it curled against her like a cold animal, reminding her that even solitude had teeth. She'd filed the papers without ceremony. There had been no fight, no protest. Brandon signed them like any contract, efficient, detached, transactional. In his mind, she imagined he had already moved on long before their names were uncoupled on paper. And yet, here she was, drinking bitter coffee, wondering why freedom felt more like freefall. Naomi blinked slowly and brought the cup to her lips. That's when she felt it. A shift in the air. Not literal, not something anyone else would have noticed. But her skin tightened, her pulse flickered, and some buried instinct made her lift her gaze toward the door. He stepped in like the wind had followed him. Tall, wrapped in a charcoal coat, drops of rain clinging to his shoulders like diamonds. His hair was tousled from the cold. His eyes, impossibly blue, scanned the room with calculated precision before locking onto her. Ethan Whitmore. She froze. Not completely, not externally, but inside, her world stopped moving. He was the man who had always hovered on the edge of her periphery. A name spoken in hushed tones at business functions. A gaze she'd caught more than once from across the room, steady, unreadable, slightly dangerous. In the past, he'd been courteous, distant, and occasionally too intense in how he looked at her. But never like this. Never here. She hadn't seen him since the gala 2 years ago. The one where she had first caught him staring across a ballroom bathed in crystal light, where she'd worn a gown that now gathered dust in the back of her closet. Back then, he had watched her like a man starving, but he had never approached, until now. He crossed the cafe slowly, boots echoing faintly against the worn tile floor. Naomi didn't move. She didn't trust her legs to support her. She watched, heart climbing higher into her throat with every step he took. When he reached her table, he didn't smile. He didn't offer small talk or pleasantries. He said, "May I?" His voice was lower than she remembered, smoother, and more dangerous for the way it wrapped itself around her name without needing to speak it. She nodded, her voice caught somewhere between breath and disbelief. He sat across from her, removing his gloves with practiced ease, folding them on the table like someone preparing for something precise, something inevitable. "How did you find me?" she asked after a beat, her voice soft, a little hoarse. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. I didn't have to look far. She arched a brow, cautious. So, you've been watching? I've been waiting, he corrected, his tone impossibly calm. There's a difference. Naomi felt heat rise to her cheeks. She wrapped her fingers tighter around her cup, grounding herself. Why? Because, he said, you were never meant to be his. The silence between them pulsed. Not heavy, not awkward, charged. Naomi didn't know what she expected from him. Pity, perhaps. Polite curiosity. But what she saw in Ethan's eyes was none of those things. It was certain. A quiet, unrelenting clarity made her spine straighten and her breath catch. She didn't know how to respond. So he continued. When I saw you with him that night at the gala, I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe you were happy. Maybe he deserved you. And now? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darkened. Now I know he never even saw you. Something inside her broke at that. Something fragile and long abandoned. A knot she hadn't even known she was still carrying loosened at the seams. Because he wasn't wrong. Brandon had never seen her. Not the way she craved to be seen. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. You don't have to explain anything. I just wanted you to know. I see you. Naomi blinked quickly, looking down, her throat tight. That's a dangerous thing to say. Why? Because I don't know if I'm ready to be seen. Ethan tilted his head, studying her. That's the thing about mirrors. You don't have to be ready. They show you anyway. Naomi looked at him then, not through the lens of fear, caution, or memory, but through a growing storm of emotion she couldn't quite name. With his unshakable composure and burning gaze, this man had walked into her quiet corner of the world and turned it on its axis with just a few words. She should have told him to leave. She should have guarded her heart, pulled the walls tighter. But she didn't. Because something in his voice, his presence, his stillness, felt like the beginning of a storm she might finally be brave enough to walk into. And somewhere deep inside her, the part that had long been cold began to thaw. The cafe had grown quieter. The background chatter had dulled to a murmur, like rain tapping gently on a faraway rooftop. Time seemed to slow in the space between Ethan and Naomi, the air suspended, the coffee forgotten. People were moving, baristas steaming milk, spoons clinking, but none reached them. Naomi's fingers curled loosely around her cup, though she wasn't drinking. Her gaze flickered toward the window briefly, then back to him. She was trying to steady herself, but something in Ethan's presence made her pulse flutter just beneath the surface. You always speak like you've already decided something, she said quietly. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened, softened. Because I have. That's dangerous, she murmured. Only if you plan to run. Naomi held his gaze, the storm in her chest growing. She had faced boardrooms of men twice her age, held her own beside Brandon at endless galas and fundraisers, endured cold nights in a mansion that echoed with silence. She'd mastered stillness and mastered pretending. But this wasn't pretend. This wasn't still. Ethan was not a man who filled silence with flattery or softened his gaze for comfort. He was still yes, but not quiet, not passive. His presence was the kind of stillness before lightning cracks the sky open. He looked at her with the certainty of someone who didn't need permission to want something. And somehow, that both terrified and thrilled her. I don't know what you want from me, she said. Ethan didn't blink. I want the truth. Naomi inhaled slowly and carefully. What if I don't know what that is anymore? He leaned back, folding his hands before him, as if considering something. Then, let me help you find it. She let out a breath, halfway between a laugh and disbelief. You don't even know me. I do, he said quietly. Not through words, not through your past. But I've watched how you carry yourself when no one thinks you're being watched. The way you withdraw to the edge of every room. The way you smile for other people's comfort, but not your own. I've seen how careful you are. And how much does that cost you? Naomi blinked hard, her throat tightening unexpectedly. Ethan's voice dropped even lower. I know what it's like to feel unseen in a room full of people. I know what it's like to be touched without ever being felt. So don't tell me I don't know you, Naomi. I know exactly who you are. Her name sounded different coming from him. It was not clipped or obligatory like Brandon used to say, but weighted, anchored, and spoken like it mattered, like he had waited a long time to say it aloud. Naomi felt her hands tremble slightly and quickly folded them into her lap. You think you're the only one who watched? She whispered. That got his attention. She didn't look up. At the gala. You were across the room. I noticed. I always noticed. Ethan stilled. I told myself it was nothing, she continued. That you were just curious, or maybe bored. And what if I wasn't? Naomi lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes full on now. Something bolder slipping through. Then it made everything harder. Because for one moment, I wished it had been you. Silence bloomed between them, sharper now, laced with something raw and honest. Ethan's jaw tensed, not in anger, in restraint. Why didn't you say anything back then? She asked, her voice barely audible. Because I don't believe in pulling someone out of a place they chose to be in, he replied. Even if I knew it was slowly killing them. That sounds noble. That sounds like a man who's been burned before, Ethan said, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. But I also believe in second chances, if they show up at the right time. Naomi tilted her head. And what makes now the right time? His reply was immediate. Because now, you're free. She exhaled shakily. There it was again, that word. Free. It still didn't fit right in her mouth. It sounded more like a verdict than a liberation. She didn't feel powerful. She felt like she had stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit something that might break her completely. Ethan seemed to sense the shift in her. He reached forward slowly, not touching her, but resting his palm on the table, his palm open, his fingers relaxed, a silent offering. I don't want to fix you, he said. I'm not here to save you. I want to know the version of you no one else took the time to see. Naomi stared at his hand for a long time, not because she didn't want to reach for it, but because she did. Her body ached for the simplicity of touch, the warmth of someone who didn't recoil, the steady grounding of a man who didn't look through her, but into her. She didn't take his hand. Not yet. But her eyes softened. And Ethan? He didn't push. He withdrew his hand slowly, a trace of something unreadable lingering in his expression. Respect, perhaps, or patience. Outside, the sky opened. Rain fell in slow sheets against the window, muffling the city, softening the world. Naomi turned her head slightly, watching droplets trace erratic paths down the glass. Ethan stood. She looked up, startled. He pulled a pen from his coat pocket, reached for a napkin on the table, and scribbled something in a slow, deliberate script. Then he slid it across to her. A number. No name. No instruction. Just a chance. I'm not going to chase you, Naomi, he said. But I won't disappear either. And with that, he turned and walked out into the rain, the door chiming softly behind him. Naomi sat still for a long time, heart loud in her ears, the napkin untouched beneath her fingertips. She hadn't made a decision, not yet. But for the first time in 2 years, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in far too long. Want. The rain didn't stop that afternoon. It painted the city in translucent silver, blurred the traffic lights into soft blinks of red and gold, and draped the sidewalks in reflections. Naomi walked the 2 blocks to her apartment with her coat clutched tight, her curls damp and coiled from the moisture, the napkin still folded in her pocket like something sacred. She didn't rush. She let the rain touch her skin, as if water alone could dilute everything churning inside her. The memory of Ethan's voice, the burn of his gaze, the startling gentleness of his words. I won't disappear. That part stuck to her ribs like honey. Not because it was romantic, but because it was unfamiliar. Men had always disappeared, even the ones who stayed left in smaller ways, with their silences. Their eyes wandered, their hands that never reached back. But Ethan hadn't asked for anything. He'd offered something steady, something opens. And that felt more dangerous than any seduction. When Naomi reached her building and stepped inside the lobby, her skin was cold, but her thoughts were hot and restless. She quietly rode the elevator to the 6th floor. The hum of old machinery, a familiar song she didn't mind. Her apartment smelled faintly of jasmine and lemon, a scent she chose not because it reminded her of anyone, but because it reminded her of no one. She shrugged off her coat, kicked off her shoes, and crossed to the small window overlooking the city's crooked skyline. The coffee shop was barely visible from here, but her memory filled in the distance. She could still see Ethan sitting across from her, like he'd been summoned from another world she hadn't dared to dream about in years. She pressed her forehead lightly to the cool window pane. She didn't want him, but she did, and that scared her more than she could admit. Naomi had always been cautious with men, even before Brandon. She'd been raised by a mother who taught her that composure was power and vulnerability was currency you never gave away freely. Growing up, she'd watched her mother hold herself like fine porcelain, beautiful, but always out of reach. So Naomi learned to speak softly, move gracefully, and smile just enough. She learned to be admired, but never truly known. But Ethan hadn't looked at her like a possession to admire. He had looked at her like a question he wanted to answer for years. And that was unraveling every thread of restraint she'd stitched so carefully over the last 2 years. She turned away from the window and crossed the room, her fingers brushing over the spines of books, the corner of the sofa, the edge of the countertops, small rituals grounding her body while her mind floated elsewhere. The napkin was still in her coat pocket. She took it out now and unfolded it carefully. Just a number. 8 digits written in black ink with a slight slant, as though even his handwriting carried weight. She stared at it. Not because she was unsure whether she'd call, but she knew, deep down, that if she did, everything would change. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for her life to change again. Brandon had never loved her. She knew that now. Maybe she had known it the whole time. But with Brandon, at least the rules had been clear. She was ornamental, polished, an extension of his success, not a partner in it. Her silence had been her contribution, her beauty, her role. He had made no promises beyond public appearances, and in his way, he had delivered exactly what he offered, nothing. Ethan was offering more, not with flowers, not with flowery language, but with the terrifying promise of being seen. Naomi pressed the napkin flat on the countertop. She stared at it for a long time before walking away. She didn't throw it away, but she didn't call either. That night, she lay in bed and didn't cry. That used to be her nighttime ritual, soft tears, muffled by the duvet. The cold absence beside her a louder ache than any argument could have been. But tonight, She didn't feel empty. She felt suspended, held somewhere between before and after. And in the quiet, the memory of Ethan's voice returned, not the words, but the sound of it, deep, grounded, just enough rasp to make her want to lean in. She didn't sleep much, but when dawn spilled through the window, Naomi got up before the alarm. She dressed slowly, carefully, not for anyone else, but for herself. A dark-fitted blouse, slim trousers, simple earrings. Nothing flashy, just enough edge to remind herself who she was now. She made coffee, drank it in silence, then opened her laptop. Her inbox was full of rejection emails from companies who liked her resume but were moving forward with other candidates. She scrolled through them without feeling anything in particular. Then, her phone buzzed. A new message. Unknown number. Do you prefer morning meetings or late nights? She stared at the screen, a slight frown pulling at her brow. Ethan. She hadn't given him her number. But of course, men like Ethan didn't need introductions or permission. He didn't ask for access. He waited for the door to open, and when it did, he stepped through like he'd always belonged there. She hesitated, then typed back. Naomi. Depends. What's the meeting about? A pause. Then the reply. Ethan. You. Naomi set the phone down, her heart punching once. Sharp, deep, low. She shouldn't like how that made her feel. But she did. The following message came almost immediately after. Ethan. I'm outside. Her breath caught. She stood so quickly that the stool scraped against the floor. She moved to the window. And there he was, leaning against a black car parked just outside the building, dressed in slate gray, hands in his coat pockets, face tilted up slightly like he knew she'd be watching. She didn't smile, didn't wave. She just looked at him. He looked up at her like he'd already waited long enough. And Naomi, still barefoot, heart racing, whispered something to herself she hadn't dared believe in a long time. Maybe I'm not afraid anymore. Naomi didn't move at first. She stood at the window, her breath a shallow hush against the cool glass, watching Ethan as if he might vanish with a blink. But he didn't. He waited, like he had all the time in the world, without intention of leaving without her. She turned from the window with practiced calm, though her heartbeat pulsed hot behind her ribs. The apartment was suddenly too small, the air too sharp, her skin too aware of itself. She strolled to her closet, not to dress up, not to impress, but to dress with purpose. A soft cream sweater, clean lines, and understated. Dark jeans, structured, strong. She pinned her hair loosely at the nape of her neck, one tendril curling down the side of her cheek. No makeup, just a touch of lip balm. Enough to feel real. Not armor. She wasn't hiding anymore. By the time she stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The pavement still glistened, but the sky had softened to a pale gray, and the city seemed to have taken a deep breath. Ethan stood beside the car, one hand casually on the roof, the other tucked into his pocket. When he saw her approach, he didn't smile. He looked at her like a man seeing something he hadn't dared to hope for. "Morning," he said, his voice lower than the breeze. "Is this a kidnapping?" she asked dryly, glancing at the sleek car behind him. "Not unless you say yes," he replied, opening the passenger door. She paused beside him, their eyes meeting with a quiet tension that hummed low and steady. "I'm not sure I'm in the mood for grand gestures," she said softly. "This isn't a gesture," Ethan murmured. "It's just a drive. No expectations." She considered that for a long moment. Then, without another word, she slid into the passenger seat. The door clicked shut behind her. Ethan rounded the hood and got in, the leather creaking softly beneath his movement. He didn't rush to start the engine. He just sat there for a beat, hands resting on the wheel, looking at her in profile. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. Naomi's gaze stayed out the window. "Neither did I." The car pulled away from the curb like a whisper. They drove in silence at first, the city falling away behind them, replaced by open streets lined with bare trees and the occasional rustle of early spring wind. Ethan didn't ask where she wanted to go. He seemed to understand she didn't want to be taken somewhere so much as taken away from what she wasn't yet ready to say aloud. 15 minutes later, he turned onto a narrow road that cut through an old park she hadn't visited in years. The trees there were tall and ancient, their branches like cathedral arches bending above the quiet path. He pulled over and turned off the engine at the edge of a small clearing. Naomi turned to him slowly. "This is where you bury your mistakes?" His mouth twitched. "No. This is where I bring the things I want to keep." That silenced her. He opened his door, approached hers, and held it open without fanfare. She stepped out, the air cool against her skin. The world smelled like wet earth and wind. It was beautiful in a quiet, forgotten way. They walked side by side toward a bench facing the water, a still pond that reflected the trees like secrets it promised never to tell. When they sat, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was layered. Ethan rested his forearms on his thighs, hands clasped, looking straight ahead. Naomi mirrored him, her fingers laced in her lap. She was the first to speak. "I don't know how to start again," she said. "You don't have to start again," he replied. "You just have to start." She looked at him then, really looked. And what she saw wasn't just a man with power or presence, someone who carried his solitude differently than most, not as armor, but as proof. He'd walked through fire and come out still human. "I built my entire life around someone who didn't even notice I was breathing beside him," she said. "And now, I wake up and don't know who I am without his silence." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, he turned toward her with that slow precision he always seemed to move with. "Let me ask you something," he said. "When you sit in a dark room long enough, and someone flips on the light, what hurts first?" Naomi blinked. "Your eyes." "Exactly. Not because the light is bad, but because you forgot what it felt like to see." Her breath caught. "I'm not trying to overwhelm you, Naomi. I'm not here to rush you," he said. "But I won't apologize for wanting to know you, the real you, not the woman who smiled through photographs or stood beside a man who never reached for her. The woman who left, the woman who chose herself." A long silence stretched between them, and Naomi felt the warmth of his words sink deeper than she expected. "I'm not good at being vulnerable," she admitted. "I'm not asking you to bleed for me," he replied gently. "Just don't pretend you're not already wounded." That struck something raw in her. Her fingers curled slightly in her lap. "Why me?" she asked, quieter now. "You could have anyone, any woman, any moment, anything." "I don't want any woman," he said, his voice low and sure. "I want the one who stood in a room full of people and didn't try to be louder than them. The one who looked like she was holding an entire world inside her, and no one thought to ask what it cost her to carry it." Naomi stared at him, her throat tight. He didn't look away. "I don't need a perfect woman," he said. "I just need a real one. And you, Naomi, you are the most real thing I've seen in a long time." Her chest rose and fell slowly, the ache in it unfamiliar, but not painful. Just alive. She looked back toward the water, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't feel like she had to perform. She just breathed, beside him, in silence, and it was enough. That evening, Naomi stood in her apartment, fingers curled around a glass of red wine she hadn't touched. The world outside her window had darkened into its usual hush of streetlights and long shadows. But inside her, something unfamiliar stirred, something that didn't quite settle into comfort, but didn't feel like fear. It felt almost, like something not yet spoken had already taken root. She thought of the pond, of the bench, of the man who'd sat beside her without trying to fill the space between them with noise. Ethan had been still, present, and terrifying in his sincerity. Naomi moved toward the window and leaned against the cool glass, watching cars slip by like whispers. The city buzzed beneath her, indifferent and beautiful, and for once, she didn't feel as if she were watching it from the outside. For 2 years, she'd lived as a beautiful shadow. Brandon had never raised his voice. He'd never hit her, never humiliated her publicly, never even spoken cruelty in plain terms. But he had erased her. Day by day, word by omission, gaze by absence. And now, she stood here in the quiet aftermath of a life she'd untethered herself from, only to find she didn't quite know how to step forward without stumbling. But Ethan, he didn't offer certainty. He didn't offer safety. He offered presence. And maybe that was rarer than anything else. She turned from the window and set the glass down, walking barefoot across the wooden floor. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. One message. She reached for it. Ethan, are you still awake? She stared at the screen, then typed back. Naomi, barely, but yes. Seconds passed. Then Ethan, come downstairs. No punctuation, no explanation. Her heart gave a jolt that was half irritation, half something she didn't have a name for. She grabbed a cardigan, slipped into flats, and went downstairs without thinking too hard about it. Some things didn't require overthinking. Some things you walked toward. He was waiting in the same car, engine off. Lights dimmed. When she opened the door and slid in beside him, he didn't say a word at first. He just looked at her like the silence belonged to them. I wasn't expecting you, she said. I wasn't planning on showing up, he replied. But I couldn't stop thinking about you. She didn't answer, but her hands were resting more easily in her lap now. I wanted to see you when it wasn't daylight, Ethan added, almost quietly. I wanted to know what you looked like when no one was watching. Naomi turned her head toward him slowly. And what do I look like? Like the truth. She looked away again, out the window. But this time, she smiled, just barely. Do you always say things like that? She asked. Only when I mean them. He reached toward the center console and opened a small compartment, pulling out a single envelope. He handed it to her without fanfare. What's this? She asked, taking it cautiously. An invitation, he said. She opened it. Inside was a folded piece of stationery, expensive, thick, and engraved with the name of a private exhibit opening at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. A sponsor-only preview. Black tie. Her name had been handwritten at the bottom. Naomi blinked. You want me to go here? With you? Yes. I'm not exactly... You're exactly what belongs there. She looked at him. You know what that kind of event means, right? He nodded. People will talk. People will assume. Ethan's gaze sharpened slightly. Let them. Naomi looked down at the invitation again. It felt too heavy in her hands. I haven't worn a gown in almost a year, she said softly. I gave most of them away. I didn't want to see them anymore. I'll send someone, he said, without hesitation. You'll wear whatever makes you feel powerful. And if I say no, then I'll return the invitation and wait for the next moment. But I won't stop asking. Naomi laughed under her breath. You don't know how to take rejection, do you? I know how to respect hesitation, he said, but I won't pretend I don't want more. She sat back, the envelope still in her lap. The air between them thickened not from tension, but from the quiet ache of things not yet said. After a moment, she turned to him again, her voice lower now. You make it very hard to stay guarded. That's not a flaw, Ethan said. That's me keeping my promise. What promise? That I would see you and never look away. The quiet swelled. Naomi felt it everywhere in her breath, fingertips, and chest. A sensation she hadn't known in years. Something dangerously close to anticipation. She didn't give him an answer that night. Not about the gala. Not about them. She slipped the invitation back into the envelope, pressed it against her heart for a moment, and whispered, I need time. Ethan nodded once, as if he'd expected that too. Take all the time you want, he said. And then, without touching her, without asking for more, he drove her home. Because this wasn't about rushing. This was about watching a woman relearn how to open doors she'd once closed forever. And Ethan was willing to stand on the threshold, as long as it took. The morning of the gala arrived like a quiet challenge. Naomi stood in front of her closet, half-dressed in hesitation and doubt. She hadn't said yes to Ethan. Not officially, not in words. But the gown hanging behind the door suggested that her silence had been taken for something else. Maybe, at the very least, a whisper of consent, too delicate to name. The dress had arrived 2 days ago and was delivered without announcement. No note, no instructions, just a black garment bag that smelled faintly of cedar and confidence. She had ignored it at first. Let it hang there like a shadow she didn't want to step into. But the fabric had whispered to her in quiet hours, the voice saying, this isn't about him. It's about you. Her breath caught as she unzipped the bag and pulled the dress free. It was simple, elegant, a rich shade of deep burgundy that would make her skin glow in candlelight. The neckline was structured but soft, the fabric heavy enough to hold her body like it mattered. It was the kind of gown that didn't scream for attention. It commanded it without effort. And something in her chest fluttered in response. She slipped into it slowly, hands steady. No shaking, no second-guessing, just a quiet purpose. Her reflection in the mirror was almost unfamiliar, not because she looked different, but because she looked seen, like she finally recognized herself. The doorbell rang at exactly 6:45. Ethan was punctual. Of course he was. Naomi opened the door to find him dressed in a black tailored suit that looked like it had been stitched by midnight itself. Crisp white shirt. No tie. The top button is undone. Understated. Controlled. Devastating. But it wasn't the clothes. It was the way he looked at her. Like the room had narrowed around her. Like gravity had found a new center. You're breathtaking, he said. She didn't blush. She didn't look away. Thank you, she replied, as if she were finally ready to accept the compliment as fact, not flattery. He offered his arm. She hesitated only a second before taking it. The car ride was quiet, not awkward, comfortable, the kind of silence that allowed space for thoughts to bloom without suffocation. Naomi stared out the window at the city as it blurred past. Her world had changed so much in such a short time, and yet it felt less like change and more like emergence. It was as if she hadn't rewritten herself, but peeled back the layers of a woman who had always been waiting beneath. When they arrived, she paused at the curb, staring at the museum's glowing entrance. She remembered standing at events like this before on Brandon's arm, smiling through clenched teeth, ignoring the subtle coldness in his fingers, wrapped around hers. This time, her arm was hooked through Ethan's, and he wasn't pulling her along. He was walking beside her. As they entered the hall, the hush of admiration was almost audible. Heads turned. Conversations paused. Not because she was Ethan Whitmore's date, but because Naomi Carter looked like she owned the room. Not with wealth, not with reputation, but with stillness, with power earned through quiet survival. Ethan didn't hover. He let her lead. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a woman being presented. She felt like a woman arriving. Later in the evening, after toasts and soft jazz and speeches from benefactors, Naomi stepped away, just for a moment. The weight of attention, however admiring, still pressed against old scars she hadn't fully learned to stop protecting. She wandered down a side corridor of the museum, heels tapping softly on marble, her fingertips grazing the edge of a sculpture's pedestal. The room she entered was dim and quiet, filled with oil portraits and silence. She stopped before a painting, a woman in a crimson dress, seated in profile, eyes cast towards some invisible horizon. She didn't know why it caught her. Perhaps because the woman in the portrait didn't look serene. She looked ready. The footsteps behind her were familiar, measured, intentional. Ethan came to stand beside her, hands in his pockets. "I was starting to think you'd disappeared," he said gently. "I just needed a moment to breathe," she replied without looking at him. "Take all the moments you need." She glanced at him then, her voice low. "Why are you so patient with me?" Ethan's gaze flicked to the painting, then back to her. "Because I know what it means to carry yourself through a world without space for you. And I know how much it costs to hold your shape." Naomi blinked, caught off guard by his words' simplicity and depth. He continued, "You don't owe me anything, Naomi. Not softness, not surrender, not even time. But I'll keep showing up, not to win you, not to rescue you, to see you over and over, for as long as you'll let me." Her throat tightened. She had spent 2 years shrinking herself into the outlines of someone else's comfort. Tonight, she felt her name's shape returning to her heart. Slowly, carefully, she reached for his hand, not out of need, not out of fear, but because she wanted to. Because maybe this was how healing began, not with declarations or confessions, but with fingers finding fingers in the middle of a museum hallway, beneath the quiet gaze of a painted woman who looked like she had once been lost. Ethan said nothing, but he held her hand like it was the beginning of everything. The sound of the elevator was a soft chime that barely broke the silence. Naomi stepped inside first, her heels tapping lightly against the polished floor of the museum's private wing. Ethan followed, hands relaxed at his sides, his presence quiet and close, not pressing, just there. She didn't look at him directly, but felt every inch of the space between them tighten like a thread drawn taut. The moment the doors slid shut, the air shifted. No more murmurs from the gallery. No more eyes watching. Just the two of them. And a silence that felt less like absence and more like anticipation. Naomi kept her gaze forward, eyes fixed on the small glowing floor indicator above the door. But her senses narrowed to the presence behind her, to the way she could feel Ethan's breath deepen, the way the heat from his body reached her skin without touch. "I wasn't sure you'd say yes tonight," he said, his voice low. She turned her head slightly, not quite facing him, but enough to let him see the curve of her jaw, the shimmer of her earring catching the light. "I wasn't sure either," she replied. The corner of his mouth curved just slightly. "And now?" "I'm not sure of anything," she said, almost too quietly to be heard. The elevator stopped. The doors opened with a soft breeze. He didn't move until she did. And when she stepped out, she didn't hesitate, though her pulse was a storm beneath her skin. The corridor was lined with tall glass panels and art installations. At the far end, an unobtrusive door opened into a private lounge reserved for donors and patrons. Dim lighting, velvet sofas, curated intimacy. Ethan swiped a keycard, and the door clicked open. Inside, the lights were soft. A single lamp glowed near the corner, casting long amber shadows against the cream walls. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city's skyline, drenched in gold and cobalt and the shimmer of nightlife far below. Naomi stepped in slowly. This wasn't new to her, this kind of space. She had stood in 100 like-it rooms designed for wealth, quiet power, and conversations meant to be remembered or buried. But this felt different, not because of where they were, but because of who she was. Now. Ethan closed the door behind them and didn't speak. He didn't move toward her, and she didn't turn to him right away. She walked to the window, hands clasped gently in front of her, eyes tracing the edges of the skyline. The silence stretched again, but it wasn't hollow. It breathed. It waited. And then she asked, without turning around, "Why haven't you touched me?" Ethan's reply was quiet. "Because I don't want to touch you like a man who's waited. I want to touch you like a man who sees you." Naomi turned slowly, gracefully, her silhouette backlit by the city. Her eyes were calm, but not cold. Her voice was steady. "And if I told you I wanted more than being seen?" Ethan took a deep and careful breath, as if he were balancing something fragile in his chest. "Then I'd ask you what more means. Tonight." She walked toward him, heels whispering against the floor. Her gaze never left his. There was no flirtation in her steps, no coyness, just decision clean, slow, and deliberate. When she reached him, she didn't touch him immediately. She stood before him, letting the inches between their bodies grow electric. "I want to feel something," she said. He looked at her, every line of his face composed, but trembling with restraint. "Are you sure it's me you want?" "Yes," she answered, without a single pause. "But I don't want you to fix me, or make anything vanish." "I wouldn't insult you like that," he said. "I just want to remind you what it feels like to be wanted." Naomi exhaled, her chest rising as though releasing something long held in. And she reached for him, not like someone seeking shelter, but like someone claiming heat after years of frost. Her fingers touched his collar first, then slid up the column of his neck to the sharp angle of his jaw. He closed his eyes briefly, his breath catching not from surprise, but from the unbearable tenderness of it. And then he kissed her, not as a storm, not as a conquest, but as a man who understood that intimacy was not about taking. It was about giving. His lips moved slowly over hers, coaxing rather than demanding. She responded kindly, not melting or surrendering, but meeting him with equal fire and intention. Her hands slid into his hair, pulling him closer, anchoring him to the moment. There was no rush, no tearing, just a slow unraveling of every wall they had carried into the room. She felt the years fall away. The silence of old beds and cold dinners dissolved against the heat of a man who kissed like he was writing something sacred across her mouth. When they parted, only slightly, he rested his forehead against hers. "Say my name," he murmured. She did. "Ethan." He closed his eyes again, as though her voice had lit something ancient in his chest. And when she whispered again, this time softer, more breath than syllable, it wasn't just his name, it was permission. And neither of them spoke again for a long time. Not with words. Because the body has its language when trust replaces fear, when want is no longer a secret, And when two people meet not just in skin, but in recognition, that night, Ethan didn't own her. He didn't possess her. He held her. And Naomi, for the first time, let herself be held without apology. Morning didn't arrive with drama, it came with quiet. A slow breath of light through floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched itself awake outside, indifferent and humming. Inside the penthouse, it was still, like the pause between two waves. Naomi lay with her eyes open, the sheets tangled around her waist, the silk of the night still clinging to her skin like memory. Ethan wasn't beside her, but his presence hadn't left. The scent of cedar and citrus was on the pillow beside hers, in the warmth still folded into the mattress, in the way her body felt, like it had finally been invited to exist, fully and without hesitation. She sat up slowly, letting the moment hold her. There was no panic, no regret, only stillness. But not the kind that came from emptiness. This was afterglow, not just of the body, but of the soul. She wrapped the sheet around herself and padded barefoot to the glass balcony doors. Outside, the city looked almost gentle, bathed in the golden hue of early day. Naomi placed her hand against the cool glass, the skyline stretching like a reminder. She was still here, still standing. And something within her had shifted. The sound of a quiet door opening behind her didn't startle her. She turned her head. Ethan stood in the doorway, barefoot. A simple white shirt rolled at the sleeves, collar undone, holding 2 mugs of coffee. His hair was still a little messy. He looked like morning incarnate, comfortable, soft around the edges, devastating without trying. He walked toward her, handing her the coffee without a word. She took it, fingers brushing his just slightly. "Then I wasn't sure if you'd still be here," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "I live 15 minutes away. It's not exactly the French Riviera." He smiled faintly. "You know what I mean." Naomi took a sip of the coffee. It was perfect. Strong. A little sweet. "You didn't strike me as someone who doubts himself." "I don't doubt myself," Ethan said. "I just don't assume other people stay." Her gaze lingered on him, thoughtful. "You've had women walk away from this view before?" "I've had women walk away from much more than that." She nodded, absorbing that without judgment. "And you let them?" "I let them choose. That's all any of us can do." Naomi looked down at the steam rising from her cup. "I didn't stay for the view," she said after a pause. Ethan's voice lowered. "Why did you stay?" She looked at him, long, steady. "Because last night didn't feel like an escape. It felt like an answer." His throat moved as he swallowed. He reached for her hand, careful, like a man still not assuming. "I don't want to be just a moment," he said. "Not for you." "I don't want anything to be just a moment anymore," she whispered. "I've spent 2 years letting days pass through me. I want to feel time again." He stepped closer, brushing his fingers gently against hers. "Then, let me walk through it with you." Naomi exhaled, not from fear, but from the strange ache of acceptance. She had built walls that didn't look like wall smiles, routines, well-pressed blouses, an elegant silence that passed as strength. But Ethan saw beneath all of it, and last night hadn't broken her. It had softened her. She looked down at their intertwined fingers. There was a strange, delicious normalcy to the way they fit. But as the light crept further into the room, so did the whisper of reality. Naomi placed the coffee on the glass table and turned toward him fully. "I don't want this to become a secret," she said. Ethan's expression didn't shift. "It won't be," he said plainly. I've had enough of being someone's hidden chapter. I want to be the title, or not be in the book at all. His hand tightened slightly on hers. You already are. Her lips parted, breath catching at how uncomplicated his words were. No promises, no grand gestures, just the truth. But truth didn't silence fear. It only lit the edges of it. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. I no longer know how to be part of someone's real life. I only remember how to perform. He took a slow step toward her. Then let's start with something easy, Ethan said. She lifted her eyes to his. Like what? Breakfast. A laugh slipped out of her then, quiet but unguarded. Are you always this charming? Only when I want someone to stay past 9 a.m. She smiled fully, this time. Not the practiced smile of gallery openings or charity brunches, a smile from the marrow. He leaned in, brushing a kiss to her temple. I'll cook, he murmured. You cook? She teased. You'll be shocked. Naomi followed him to the kitchen, the sheet still wrapped around her like a second skin, the air between them humming with a new rhythm familiar and unknown. She didn't know what came next. She didn't need to, because for the first time, next wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Naomi never expected pancakes. She sat at the kitchen island in one of Ethan's crisp white shirts. The sleeves rolled halfway up her arms, legs curled beneath her on the tall chair. Her hair was still tousled from sleep or something very much like it. And her skin glowed with a softness that wasn't just light. It was peace. Across from her, Ethan stood by the stove, one hand flipping something on a skillet, the other holding a spatula like a precision tool. He looked focused, almost comically serious for a man cooking breakfast in bare feet and rolled-up sleeves. She watched him move, efficient, quiet, almost graceful, and wondered if this had always been inside him. The softness, the domestic calm, the steadiness that didn't waver even under intimacy's glare. What? He asked without looking up. You're not what I thought you'd be. He glanced at her then. And what did you think I'd be? Colder, she admitted. Sharper. Distant. He flipped the last pancake onto a plate and turned off the stove. That version of me exists, but not around you. She blinked, absorbing the weight of that sentence. Ethan set the plate in front of her and slid into the opposite seat. For a moment, they just sat in the morning stillness, the city's quiet hum floating through the open balcony door, the smell of syrup and butter grounding them in something almost startlingly normal. Naomi picked up a fork and tasted a bite. She paused. Oh my God, she said, genuinely startled. These are good. Ethan smirked. I told you. No, you downplayed it. This is criminally good. He leaned his elbow on the counter and rested his chin in his palm, watching her. You surprise me too, he said. Naomi looked up, chewing slowly. How so? You didn't run. She set her fork down carefully. I still could. I know. There was no challenge in his voice, just a quiet truth, and it made her chest tighten. Later, she stood in front of the mirror in the guest bathroom, brushing out her hair. The shirt hung off one shoulder, and she hadn't bothered to button it up. She stared at her reflection, not to adjust anything, but to see. There was a softness in her face that she didn't recognize. Not weakness. Relief. Like a woman waking from a long winter. She touched the edge of the sink, grounding herself. And that's when her phone buzzed. She ignored it at first. The world could wait. But it buzzed again. And again. 3 missed calls. 2 messages. From Brandon. Her body went still. She stared at the screen, something cold trickling down the back of her neck. She hadn't spoken to her ex-husband in over a year. There was no need, no shared property, no ties, no children, nothing. She hesitated and opened the message. Naomi, we need to talk. Urgent. Then another. I saw the gala photos. You're making a mistake. The words sat on her screen like bruises. She locked the phone and set it face down on the marble counter. For a moment, the room tilted slightly, past colliding with the present in a way that stole her breath. The memory of Brandon's voice is sharp and calculating. The way he made everything feel like her misstep. Her fault. She closed her eyes. Not now. Not today. She stepped back into the kitchen with her face composed, but Ethan noticed. He looked up from the sink where he was rinsing dishes. Everything okay? Naomi nodded. Too quickly. Yeah, just work. Nothing important. Ethan dried his hands and studied her. Not prying and just reading. You don't have to tell me, he said quietly. But you don't have to lie either. Naomi leaned against the counter, arms folded. My ex-husband messaged me. Ethan's expression didn't change, but the air around him stilled. I haven't heard from him in a year, she continued. And suddenly he's concerned. Ethan's voice was measured. Because of me? Because I looked happy, she said, the bitterness in her tone barely masked. And people like him don't like it when their ghosts stop haunting. He walked over to her slowly, deliberately. When he reached her, he gently placed a hand on the small of her back, not to guide, claim, just to be there. You don't owe him your silence, or your fear. I'm not afraid, she said quickly. I didn't say you were, he replied softly. But even strong women flinch when someone reappears where they were never wanted. Naomi dropped her gaze, the knot in her stomach pulsing like a warning. He made me feel small for so long, she admitted. Ethan's hand slid to her waist, anchoring her. You are not small. She let herself rest against his chest for a moment. And in that breath of closeness, something inside her recalibrated. She had built her life after divorce like a house of quiet rituals. Order, control, nothing spontaneous, nothing open to interpretation. Now, Ethan had walked in and lit a match to the routine, not to burn it down, but to warm it. She wasn't ready to collapse into him, but she didn't want to push him away either, so she whispered, "Don't treat me like glass." And he whispered back, "I never have." That night, Naomi stood in front of her apartment window, alone again. Ethan had walked her home, kissed her forehead gently, and didn't ask to come up. She didn't offer. There was power in that pause. She stared out at the city, the message from Brandon still sitting in her phone like a weight. She hadn't responded. She wouldn't. But the past wasn't just something to delete. It had roots. And now, for the first time, she was ready to dig them out, not to forget, but to reclaim the ground. Because Ethan hadn't rescued her. He'd reminded her that she didn't need saving. Only space to choose. And tomorrow she would. The next morning, Naomi arrived at the gallery early, earlier than usual. The silence of the white-walled space before opening felt like a balm, calm, structured, sterile, in the way she used to find comfort. She strolled past the featured installation, trailing her fingers along the curve of a suspended glass sculpture. It shimmered under the track lights, like frozen breath. It reminded her of Ethan how something could be strong and delicate, not fragile, but intentional. And yet, her breath felt uneven. She was still thinking about the message, about Brandon, about the ghosts that didn't knock before they reappeared. Her phone buzzed again on the desk. She didn't check it. Instead, She poured herself a cup of the bitter black coffee from the staff machine and stood at the corner window, watching pedestrians begin their day. They looked so sure of their destinations. I was unaware that someone else's past might be walking just a few steps behind. Behind her, the door opened with a soft chime. "Miss Carter?" Her assistant Liana clutched a stack of papers with a look of mild panic. Naomi turned, instinctively adjusting the cuffs of her blouse. All composure. "There's someone here to see you," Liana said, hesitating. "He doesn't have an appointment." Before Naomi could respond, she heard it. His voice. "Naomi." Her spine stiffened. "Brandon." He looked the same, a little leaner. The suit was immaculate, the tie slightly loosened to appear casual. Though everything about him was calculated, Brandon always knew how to appear less dangerous than he was. That was part of the threat. "5 minutes," he said, holding his hand like a peace offering. "That's all I ask." Naomi didn't answer immediately. She looked at Liana, who stood uncertain at the threshold. "It's fine," Naomi said quietly. "I'll speak with him in the conference room." Liana gave a subtle nod and exited. Naomi led Brandon past a wall of modernist oil paintings into a glass-walled meeting space and closed the door behind them. She didn't sit. Neither did he. Brandon looked at her for a moment too long, as if assessing whether she still flinched. "You look good," he said, smiling faintly. Naomi folded her arms. "Say what you came to say." He exhaled, hands sliding into his pockets. "I saw the photos. You and Whitmore. Is that why you're here?" she said, her tone cool. "To comment on my love life?" "I'm here because you're making a mistake." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "And you've suddenly become my compass?" Brandon stepped closer, not enough to threaten, but enough to tighten the air between them. "You don't know him." "Not really. Guys like him collect things. Women, influence, art. You're a phase." She let the words hang, then answered, calmly, "If I am, I'm still more than you ever gave me credit for." He blinked, and Naomi smiled, a slight, lethal curve of her lips. Not cruel, just true. "You never saw me," she said. "Not really. You loved the version of me that stayed quiet and performed perfectly." "That's not fair." "No, Brandon," she interrupted, voice sharper now. "What wasn't fair was making me feel like intimacy had an expiration date, that love was only valuable if it came without complexity, that I was only desirable until I asked for something more than being your accessory." He exhaled again, this time slower. "I didn't come to fight," he said. "I came to remind you that I knew you before all of this. You knew the version of me surviving," she replied, "not the one who's finally living." She moved past him and opened the door. "We're done here." Brandon hesitated. "He'll leave you." Naomi turned to face him one last time. "Then I'll still be standing." That evening, Naomi didn't call Ethan. She needed silence, not because she was unsure, but because something had shifted, and she wanted to feel it alone first. The confrontation had been minor in the scale of things, but inside her, it echoed. She stood on her balcony that night, with a glass of wine and the city below her feet, remembering who she was before all of this, before the performance, before the roles, before Ethan looked at her and saw Naomi, not as a symbol, not as a body, but as a woman with a spine made of questions and softness wrapped in steel. She hadn't always believed she could be both, but now she did. The next morning, there was a knock on her apartment door. When she opened it, Ethan stood there. No warning, no text, just him. And in his Honda small paper bag from the bakery she'd mentioned once in passing, months ago. Inside, her favorite, a still warm almond croissant. "How did you?" "I listen," he said. Naomi took the bag. The warmth of it spread through her fingers and up her arms like something holy. "I needed to see you," he continued, "but not to ask for anything." She looked up at him. "Then why?" "To remind you that I'm still here." She stepped aside and let him in. Not because she was surrendering, but this time, letting someone in wasn't a defeat. It was a choice. Her choice. It was raining in the city, a fine mist that blurred headlights and turned sidewalks into quiet reflections of the sky, the kind of rain that softened everything, even the sharp edges of doubt. Naomi stood barefoot on her balcony, wrapped in one of Ethan's sweaters, too big, too warm, too familiar, and watched the world shimmer behind the downpour. Her curls had begun to curl tighter with the humidity, and her skin carried that incredible, tingling scent of air just before thunder. Inside, the apartment was dim, golden lamplight spilling across wood floors and casting soft shadows along the shelves filled with books, vases, framed photographs that hadn't been updated in years. It was the same space she had designed meticulously after her divorce, a place that felt controlled, curated, untouched. But now, it breathed differently. Ethan was in her kitchen, cooking again. She heard the gentle clink of utensils, the low hum of his voice humming to himself, a melody she didn't recognize but suddenly wished she could memorize. And she realized something startling. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't an intrusion. It was rhythm. A slow unfolding of presence, steady as breath. She turned back toward the living room and watched him move. He wasn't trying to impress. No theatrics. Just a man who paid attention. A man who remembered which drawer held the extra spoons and how she liked her wine chilled, not cold. There was something unspeakably intimate about that. More than kisses. More than sex. Knowing. Seeing. Remaining. She stepped inside and leaned against the doorway. He looked up. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said softly. Ethan tilted his head. "Doing what?" "This. Showing up with food, warmth, and kindness like you're trying to undo years of someone else's damage." He set the ladle down gently, wiping his hands on a towel, and walked over to her. "I'm not undoing anything," he said. "I'm building something. With you, if you let me." Naomi's breath caught, because those words weren't sweet. They were sacred. She didn't answer right away. Her heart was too full of ache and awe. Instead, she took his hand and led him to the couch. No plans, no agenda. Just silence between two people learning how to sit inside something honest. They ate with their knees touching, sharing stories between bites, laughter spilling out at odd intervals. Ethan told her about his first job at 17, stocking shelves in a hardware store. Naomi told him about the summer she tried to dye her hair blonde and looked like a toasted marshmallow. It wasn't grand. It wasn't romantic in the cinematic sense. It was real. And it tasted better than anything she'd known. Later, as the rain deepened outside, Naomi curled into him on the couch, her head resting in the hollow of his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Do you believe in timing?" she asked. Ethan's voice was a murmur. "I believe in choices. Timing is what people say when they're afraid to choose." She smiled against his shirt. "I was terrified. So was I." She pulled back just enough to look at him. "You're not now?" He shook his head. "I'm still afraid. But I'm here anyway." Naomi closed her eyes. That was the most courageous thing anyone had ever said to her. Not "I love you," not yours, but I'm here anyway. Because love wasn't loud. It wasn't always spoken with grand confessions or explosive passion. Sometimes it was a quiet decision to stay, to listen when someone went silent, to offer space, not pressure, to be the calm, not the storm. By midnight, the rain had faded into a hush. Ethan had fallen asleep on the couch, his arm draped loosely around her waist, breathing deep and even. Naomi lay awake beside him, fingers tracing patterns on his forearm. She wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time, she didn't need to know. Because there was no longer a before, she needed to erase. There was only this, her body against his, the weight of a soul slowly learning how to be held, not possessed, not managed, just held. And somewhere in that stillness, she allowed herself to believe it. Maybe love wasn't what came after everything else was fixed. It could be what fixed everything along the way. Gently, patiently, quietly, like the space between breaths. Morning arrived like a whisper, not a declaration. It crept in beneath the blinds in soft strips of gold, brushing over Naomi's bare shoulder as she stirred awake. The room was quiet, no traffic noise, no buzz of emails or messages, no echoes of the past clattering in her chest. Just stillness, the kind that didn't ask questions or offer apologies. Ethan was already awake. He stood by the window, dressed in dark slacks and a white shirt, sleeves rolled up, collar unbuttoned. He wasn't looking at her, but at the city like he was considering it, weighing its promises, expectations, and tendency to take more than it gave. But his hands were holding a mug, and that small domestic detail softened the entire frame of him. Naomi sat up slowly, drawing the covers to her waist. "You always get up before me," she said, voice still soaked in sleep. Ethan turned, eyes warm. "Only when I don't want to wake you." She smiled faintly. "You're too polite." "No," he said, walking over, placing the mug on the nightstand beside her. "I'm learning patience." He sat at the edge of the bed, brushing a strand of her hair behind her ear. Naomi leaned into the touch knot, because she was melting. Not because she needed it, but because she wanted it. There was a difference. She looked at him carefully. "Do you still think I'm a mystery?" Ethan tilted his head. "You're not a mystery. You're a novel. One I haven't finished reading yet, and I don't want to skip ahead." She laughed softly, that rare sound that always caught him off guard. "You do realize that most people prefer spoilers?" she teased. "Not me. I want to earn every page." Naomi's throat tightened, because that, again, was not something beautiful for the sake of romance. That was who he was. A man who didn't demand, didn't unravel her story with impatient fingers. A man who waited until she was ready to turn the next chapter herself. And maybe, just maybe, she was. Later that day, they walked through a neighborhood market together. No security, entourage, or disguises. Just a billionaire in worn sneakers beside a woman who didn't care who recognized her anymore. Naomi picked through a basket of peaches, pressing her thumb gently to check their ripeness. Meanwhile, Ethan was haggling badly with a vendor over wildflowers. She watched him from a distance. The way he let the woman behind the stall win the argument with a half smile, handing over more cash than necessary, and walking away with a bouquet so mismatched it somehow worked. "Let me guess," Naomi said when he returned. "You lost." "I didn't even play," he admitted. "But I got these." He handed her the bouquet sunflowers. Lavender, something pale and unnamed. She took them. No one stared. No cameras clicked. And in that moment, Its simplicity hit her harder than all the grand gestures of her past life. She didn't need glitter to be seen. She needed this, a moment that didn't require translation or permission. That evening, as twilight folded over the city, Naomi sat at her kitchen counter, watching Ethan uncork a bottle of wine. The day had passed in small wonders: burned toast at brunch, shared umbrellas during a sun shower, long pauses that didn't ache for filling. Now, the house was quiet again, but not empty. He poured 2 glasses and passed one to her. She looked at him, fingers lightly grazing his. "I'm not who I was when we met," she said. Ethan didn't flinch. "I know. I don't always trust softness. I test people. I shut down when I feel seen too deeply. I know. I have moments when I still hear his voice," she whispered. "Not yours, his." He made me feel like I was too much and never enough simultaneously. Ethan set his glass down, stepped closer. Not to kiss her, not to touch, just to be present. "You're not too much," he said slowly. "You're the exact right amount of everything." Naomi's chest rose, breath catching in the place where fear used to live. "I need time," she said. "You have it. I may not always know how to love you cleanly. I'm not asking for clean. I'm asking for honest." Naomi nodded. And this time, when she leaned in, it wasn't hesitation, it was decision. The kiss was not urgent, not wild, but it was thorough. Like 2 people choosing not just each other, but also choosing themselves within the other. That night, as they lay in bed, limbs entwined, not from need but from ease, Naomi stared up at the ceiling and whispered into the hush. "I used to think love was a room with locks." Ethan turned slightly, brushing his lips to her temple. "And now?" She exhaled. "Now I think it's a window, and you opened it." He didn't reply. He didn't have to. His fingers slid over hers, interlacing them in the dark. And in that moment, Naomi Carter, the woman who measured her worth by silence and survivale herself, rest. Not because she was finished, but because she'd found a place where her scars weren't questions. They were stories, respected and not rewritten. Loved, not despite, but because. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Spring came slowly, as forgiveness does, hesitant at first, then all at once. Naomi stood on the rooftop terrace of the gallery, surrounded by evening air scented with jasmine and fresh paint. Below, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm horns, laughter, the hum of a world that never stopped. But up here, it was quiet. Up here, the noise belonged only to her thoughts. She was wearing white tonight, not a wedding gown, just a dress that felt like beginning again. Light, clean, unburdened. Inside, guests milled about with wine and soft jazz floating beneath the glass dome ceiling. Ethan had sponsored the exhibition, but the pieces were hers. Not owned, not borrowed. Hers. She could feel him watching. And when she turned, he was there. Ethan stood by the doorway, in a black suit with no tie, hands tucked casually in his pockets. His gaze didn't scan the room. It stayed fixed on her, like she was the only thing worth watching. She walked to him, each step measured not out of uncertainty, but intention. "You look like you belong in a painting," he said quietly when she reached him. "Only if you frame me with patience," she murmured. He smiled, the kind that didn't ask for anything in return. Later that night, when the crowd had faded and the lights had dimmed, they sat side by side on a bench facing the last painting, one Naomi had created herself. It was abstract and bold, nothing like her usual work. "What's it called?" Ethan asked. She hesitated. then said softly, "The room with no locks." He looked at her, and she explained, "It's not about escape. It's about being somewhere you don't need to lock the door behind you, where staying is a choice, not a condition." He nodded. "And this room, do I get to stay?" Naomi looked down at their joined hands, then back at the canvas. "You already have." They didn't marry right away. There were no vows under rose-covered arches, no orchestras, no rented fairy tale. What they had was quieter, realer. On Sunday mornings, Ethan read aloud from his favorite poetry books, mispronouncing the French titles to make her laugh. Naomi painted in the afternoon sun while he cooked, her music playing from a vintage speaker he'd hunted down in Brooklyn, because she once mentioned missing that particular crackle. When they argued, and they didn't raise their voices. They raised the questions that mattered. Where did that come from? What are you afraid of? How can I meet you where you are? They healed in layers, sometimes slowly, but never backward. Naomi still had moments of doubt. Sometimes she'd wake from dreams where Brandon's voice echoed in shadows, or she'd flinch at intimacy offered too quickly. But Ethan never rushed her. He waited, listened, and reminded her, with gestures more than words, that love doesn't demand, it invites. One morning, Ethan pulled out a small envelope as they stood in the middle of her apartment, surrounded by boxes and paint samples and the scent of fresh coffee. No ring, just a folded piece of paper. On it, written in his precise, all-caps handwriting, "I promise to stay in the room, even when it's quiet, especially then." Naomi didn't cry. She just kissed him. Because she understood now the grandest gestures weren't loud. They were consistent. And if you were standing on the street below their apartment some nights, when the windows were open and the breeze was soft, you might hear jazz playing and laughter and the soft hum of two lives gently aligned. No locks, no ultimatums, just a door left open for love to walk in and stay. Thank you for following Naomi and Ethan's story to this point. Stories like theirs aren't fairy tales. They're not about rescue or perfection. They're about resilience, choice, and the slow, beautiful labor of building love that lasts. If their journey moved you, made you reflect, or even made you smile, don't forget to like, comment on your favorite moment, and follow the channel for more stories like this. Sometimes, the quietest stories are the ones that leave the deepest mark. Until next time, keep your heart open and leave the door unlocked.